Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be a bit of a controversial one, which I personally always think is so much fun to film. That's right, today I'm going to be filming popular books that I do not think are worth the hype. These are all books that I feel like, one, did not live up to their expectation or huge amounts of hype. They were either just okay or honestly quite bad, if I'm being honest. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. First book I'm going to say is overhyped is A Day of Fall and Night by Samantha Shannon. This book has a 4.5 on Goodreads. It honestly felt fitting to start with this book as I did include Priory of the Orange Tree in my last version of this video, and this is actually a prequel release to that same exact series. I gave it another chance because I want to love this series so badly, but unfortunately just elements of it just does not land for me. This is an example of a book series that I don't think is bad or anything, but more so elements of the plotting just confuse me as to why everyone loves it and I just for some reason cannot fully get on board. I will say I did have the exact same problems with A Day of Fall and Night as I did with Priory of the Orange Tree, so I suppose we can say that Samantha Shannon is at least very consistent. So if you like the first one, you're definitely going to like the prequel, but I would say if you were disappointed with the first one, you'll likely also be disappointed with the prequel as well. But this series is basically two standalone fantasy novels set in a fantasy world where there are these things called wrens, which are kind of like dragon-like creatures. Thousands of years prior to the start of both of these series, there's basically this evil fire-breathing wren that almost brought about the end of the world, but it was defeated, captured, and kind of like put to sleep. As a result of this like very intense conflict, cultures basically formed their religion and philosophy around their perspective of wrens, which is definitely the most interesting aspect of this book in my opinion. There are some kingdoms that worship water wrens, obviously very separate from the fire-breathing wrens, and obviously fear and detest fire wrens. And there are also some cultures that detest all wrens. And you see how these different kingdoms and politics evolve over time. And because of their different philosophies, they tend to have conflict with one another, but it all stems from this like origin conflict of the wrens itself, which again is a super cool concept, and I actually really like how this is explored throughout both of these books. An issue that I had in both installments is just the plot pacing. While I thought the characters and the concepts are really cool and strong, the actual escalation of the plot, the conflict, everything about it either felt really prolonged in some parts and then really quick in other parts, so it just didn't feel even with the pacing. I also felt in particular with this prequel installment that there were some really superfluous plot lines that felt either really conveniently wrapped up for the sake of the story or just like never wrapped up at all, which I also felt to be very confusing because they also didn't really feel necessary to the plot itself. So really, what was the point of introducing them if you weren't going to wrap them up? You know what I mean? But overall, while I like the characterization and a lot of the world building and the dialogue elements of this book, just the plot pacing is a consistent problem with me with this particular series. This is one I want to love, and unfortunately I was let down by the first one and the prequel too, and I just don't fully understand the hype. Like, I can understand people liking this book, picking up this book, but it just seems everyone loves it and like not me. And I just want to know what I'm missing here, you know what I mean? The next book that is on my list is another one that I'm a little nervous to mention just because it has such a huge fan base, but I honestly have to say The Wheel of Time. And this is just a personal select for me. I have read the first 3 books in the series and I'm about 30% way through the 4th book. This is a series as a fantasy lover and reader I've known about my entire life. I've known about it since I was a kid. My brother's read it. He loved it. And I want to be a fan of this series so badly. Like, I went in this series with the biggest rose-colored glasses just looking for a good time. And I just feel like I've been chronically confused and disappointed by the reading experience of this the entire time. To take a step back, this is definitely another example of a series that I don't think is like terrible by any means. It's more so I just don't understand what everyone else sees in it. I desperately want to see the same things as everyone else, but it just feels like such a slog. Every time I pick up one of these books, it's like almost painful to get through. Elements of it I enjoy, but it's just such a slow reading experience, and it's just like so not fun, if I'm being honest, in some aspects. And don't get me wrong, I've read many very long fantasy series in my day. It has nothing to do with the length or the amount of words or the amount of perspectives. It's really just the writing style and the plot pacing of this series that just not click with me. And what also makes it really difficult to like want to continue with the series is that everyone says like the first few books are their favorite, and then it gets really slow and boring a bit in the middle, and then it picks up again. And I'm sitting here like, I've read almost the first 4 books and all of them have been so slow to me. So like, when is it going to pick up? Like, is it worth me continuing please let me know. But obviously, The Wheel of Time is one of the most famous fantasy series. It is a classic chosen one trope. There is essentially this evil power that is threatening the end of the world, and we follow one of our main characters who is kind of the chosen individual to fight against this dark evil power, but it also could like corrupt him along the way. There's lots of side characters, including his friends and other powerful individuals in this world. Again, elements of the series I've really enjoyed. I particularly like this sort of magic group of individuals, and I also really like some of our main characters' friends. But even still, I just don't understand Robert Jordan's like plot pacing. He will spend an agonizing amount of time on things that don't feel significant or important at all, and then we'll get to the part that feels like the peak of the plot for the book that you're reading, and like a main character will fall asleep and we'll just wake up and the conflict is over. I just left there thinking I'm not even gonna get to be able to read the fight. Just the before and after? Come on, Robert. Series I personally feel like I need to take a little bit of a break from. It's not one I'm going to be giving up on yet, though if this was like any other author that had a little less notoriety, I probably would have DNF'd a while ago. Elements of it I do enjoy. I love how cozy and like classic it feels. Obviously, this is a very influential series in the fantasy space, and I want to get to the Brandon Sanderson books that are at the end of this series, but I just don't know what it is. I just don't understand how everyone is obsessed with this. I want to be too, but it's just not working out. The next book that is on my overhyped book list is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This is a sort of dark fantasy story that also has a pretty large romantic subplot line. I wouldn't say this is romantasy, but it is definitely one that has a mix of fantasy and romance. I was personally really looking forward to picking this book up because I love both of those things, and this book has a 4.33 on Goodreads, so I actually had rather high expectations going into it, especially because it was said to be strong in both of these arenas. Unfortunately, the part that actually fell flat for me wasn't actually the fantasy component, but instead the romance component, which I was shocked by. But let's talk a bit more about what this book is about. This, again, is set in a dark fantasy world that's sort of surrounded by this mist. It's a kingdom where in which every single year the mist is encroaching further and further on the land, making things like growing crops and general survival more and more difficult. Our main character basically has this voice or monster living in her head as a result of touching a magical object when she was a child. This voice or individual does protect her quite a bit, but it's also something that she has to keep secret. In this fantasy world, there's also this magic system surrounding a deck of cards. Basically, you're able to touch different cards and it imbues you with a specific type of power. And obviously, the ownership of these cards is really, really sought after, with really powerful families trying to get as many as they can. Enter in our main character, who stumbles across what she first thinks is like a highway robbery sort of situation, but actually is more so like a rebellious plotline that she sort of begins to get involved in. Again, I actually thought the fantasy world and setup was a pretty strong and interesting one, especially for more of a romance-leaning fantasy story. I also liked the magic system. I thought it was unique and interesting and well thought out. The part that threw me off was actually the characterization and the romance pacing. There was just not that like slow burn, smoldering, will they, won't they? I wasn't really sold on their attraction to one another. The banter just wasn't there. Like, just all of the fun parts of what I really love and like a good romance story just wasn't totally present in this. So while I liked the fantasy elements where it lived up to my expectations that I had for it for this book, the romance part really let me down, which I really was not anticipating, but I have to be honest about. So yeah, I think this book is a little overhyped. Speaking of romance books that I think are a little bit overhyped, let's go ahead and run through a few of them. First, we have the Bridgerton series by Julia Quinn. I, like many people in this world, watched the television show and honestly really enjoyed it. The first season was okay, but seasons 2 and Queen Charlotte I thought were fantastic. So I decided to turn to the books and read a few because I am a big Regency romance fan, and generally speaking, I love these tropes and setups, but I was really disappointed by the books I did read. I felt that the characters were so much more meek than how they were represented in the show. The plot lines were just not as intriguing, and the power dynamics between the characters just weren't there for me. This is one of those rare occasions where I feel like the show was better than the book. I just felt like the writers in this instance just made all of the right changes to make it a more interesting and perhaps a bit of a more modern story, even though it's still set in the past, you know what I mean? But the Bridgerton series is a classic Regency romance setup where we're following a variety of very hot and eligible dukes find love. And the one I most recently read was The Viscount Who Loved Me, which inspired Bridgerton season 2, which is one of my favorite pieces of like Regency television. It was so good, but the book was just not. It was not it for me. I did not like our main character. I found her whiny and insecure, which I did not love because she had a lot to be very secure about herself anyway. I found our main character to be a lot less dynamic and interesting. And again, I just didn't love the relationship power dynamic in the book itself, and it was just a really big letdown. And this book is generally very, very liked, and so is the series. Obviously, it was adapted into a television show, but I think I'm just gonna stick with the show, personally, and read other Regency romance authors that I like more. Moving on, I'm now going to quickly mention 2 romantasy books that I have read that I just did not like very much. The first is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which I'm going to keep very, very brief because I have talked about this book a lot on my channel recently. But this follows our main character Violet, who enters a very, very dangerous like dragon riding military school. Basically every single day, all of the cadets have to fight to survive, not only their classroom setting, but also against each other. It's a very intense and bloody affair, if you will. Our main character arrives there kind of smaller and weaker than everyone else, and also the daughter of the general of the army, which kind of paints a target on her back. In particular, there's a character named Xaden, who is the son of a rebel, and they're supposed to like hate and despise each other, but they begin to grow closer inexplicably. You get the idea here. I did not like pretty much anything about this book. First and foremost, the plot just did not make a lot of sense. There were so many plot holes. There was a total lack of world building, and it was completely reliant on people's understandings of fantasy tropes to even make coherent. And on top of that, what I really feel like is the main sell is the romance. And while I did enjoy elements of it in the beginning from a romantasy reader's point of view, I found that the end again just escalated it into directions that were unnecessary and did not make sense for the amount of time they've spent with each other and the amount of conversations they had with one another. At least make them mates or like fated mates or something, but alas, here we are. So unfortunately, I did not like this book. I gave it like a 2 stars. It has like a 4.28, maybe 4.4 on Goodreads. And the next book I'm going to mention is Guild by Raven Kennedy. This is the first book, kind of more so a prequel book to the Plated Prisoner series, which is a romantasy Midas retelling sort of book. Here's the deal, I actually like book 2. If you especially like romantasy kind of centering enemy camp, sort of enemies to lovers situation, maybe check out book 2 and completely skip over book 1, because book 1 I thought was terrible in a much different way than, let's say, Fourth Wing, because in my opinion, Guild is just like almost irresponsible in terms of how it writes trauma. There was so much on-page trauma. It was very difficult to read. I understand the author was trying to give voice to our main character's past and everything that she went through, but I just felt it was very, very gratuitous in a way that I personally felt very, very uncomfortable with. So I did not like this book at all, and I do not recommend checking it out or reading it. If you do want to read this series, again, just skip on over to book 2. I don't think reading the prequel is necessary in any way. Personally speaking, this is just from my own personal opinion, but yeah, I don't like this book. I don't like it. Next up, I have Fairy Tale by Stephen King. This is the first Stephen King book I've actually ever read, and unfortunately, I did not like it very much. Again, this was not like a 2-star read, but it was definitely like a low 3-star read for me. I was very surprised by how much I did not enjoy it. But if you're not familiar, Fairy Tale is a portal-based fantasy. You're following your main protagonist, this young man who's just like a really good Samaritan, a really good kid. He basically starts taking care of this dog for this grumpy old man who lives on this like faraway property in his town. Once they get close and due to a variety of circumstances, he realizes that there is a magical portal on this piece of land, and he has to go on an adventure with this dog through this fantastical and magical place, and a bunch of other stuff begins to unfurl from there. Conceptually speaking, I love this book. Honestly, the first third of this book I really, really enjoy. The slow build-up, the discovery of this magical place, and the initial like exploration of this magical place I also thought was super cool. But the plotting in the middle and the end felt not only very conventional, but also just like very underwhelming. Like I felt like we had all of this build-up for this plot payoff that just was not there. So I just felt a little like, that's it by the end of the book, you know what I mean? I also felt the characterization, particularly with our main character, just so typical. He felt more like a caricature than like a real person to root for, you know what I mean? And while I liked elements of the fantasy world building, again, it just didn't totally land. I wanted to love this book. I love portal fantasy. I love like exploring new magical places. I actually wanted more of that in this story. I felt like a lot of it was like accelerated and condensed, which again was a bit confusing because we got so much in the beginning in terms of a slower pacing, but then everything just sort of sped up so much when we actually got to the meat of the fantasy book, you know? But yeah, I just didn't love this as much as I thought I would. Just disappointing because it was my first Stephen King book, which feels random to start with fairy tale, but it was a new release that everyone was loving, so I thought I would check it out, and it just did not land for me. Next up, I have Daughter of the Moon Goddess. This is another book I really wanted to love, but unfortunately I was surprised by how much I did not like it. Conceptually, this has so many plot elements I tend to really enjoy, but alas, it didn't work. This story follows our main character, who in fact is the daughter of the moon goddess. She spends her days sort of hiding in her mother's like captive castle, as she has been imprisoned by the celestial emperor in this world. Unfortunately though, our main character's magic spikes one day, kind of alerting her presence to the emperor, so she's forced to flee into the empire itself. There she travels, takes on various trials. She actually meets the emperor's son, the prince, and they begin training with each other. Again, quest, adventure story following our main character. I thought I was gonna love it. But unfortunately, the pacing didn't work for me. Everything was sort of moving so fast in a way that I never felt I could be rooted in the story and also root for the characters or feel the danger of certain like plot scenarios. It just felt like as soon as I begun to kind of conceptually care, it was like over and we were moving on to the next thing, you know what I mean? And for that reason, it just didn't fully like click with me as much as I desperately wanted to. But this is one that is obviously very loved, and I wish I loved it as everyone else. So if it does sound interesting, maybe check it out for yourself and see before you write it off completely, because I didn't like it. Next up, I have Sorcery of Thorns by Margot Rogerson, another book I am just perplexed by everyone's love for. This book has over 100,000 reviews on Goodreads and has a 4.07, which is so high, and this book just is nonsense if I'm being honest. Conceptually speaking, a great idea, but the execution just fell flat entirely. This story follows our main character, who has been raised and lives and works within a magical library. The books are like alive and they're very dangerous, and they're constantly trying to escape or like open up or release magic into the world, and it's up to our main character and the other people who work there to basically protect the outside world from this happening. Really powerful grimoire like opens and unleashes really powerful magic into the world, and our main character basically has to figure out what in the world is going on and deal with the consequences of this event. Again, the idea is so cool. I love this like dark magical library setting that's dangerous, but unfortunately the plot was like incoherent in my opinion. I also found like the villain to be so mustache twirly and obvious from page 1 that it was just like there was all these reveals that were just like, of course, I thought you were gonna go somewhere else with this because this seemed like too obvious a choice. I was just constantly surprised by how I did not like how the story unfurled basically after the exposition of this book. I was so disappointed by it. I just do not understand the hype surrounding this book. Personally speaking, it was not one I liked very much at all. I do like this author's writing style. I like her lyrical nature. I've read other books by her I have enjoyed, but this one, which seems to be her most popular one, I did not like at all. And the last series I'm going to talk about is The Drowning Empire, the first one being The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. This is a fantasy series I have given a lot of chances. I really wanted to love this series. This trilogy almost hurts to include on this list because I wanted this to be one that I loved. I actually liked the first one okay, but the more I sit with it, the less I like it, and I especially did not like the second book in this series very much at all. This is one that confuses me because so many reviewers that I love and we have such similar tastes to also loved this book, so I also feel like I'm a little bit on an island and just confused. Like, what am I missing? Am I dumb? Like, should I give it yet another chance to try to figure out like why I'm not clicking with this book too much? Conceptually speaking, this book is great. I love the magic system and the overall setup, but just the characterization and the actual plotting of it left me very underwhelmed. This is set in a world where everything is sort of controlled by this very powerful emperor and this empire. He's able to rule with an iron fist because he has something called bone shard magic, which allows him to power up these constructs, which can handle a variety of jobs from being spies across the empire to like clean the kitchen. They can just do a lot of different things, and they're completely and all controlled via the emperor. In this book, we follow a variety of characters. First is the daughter of the emperor. We follow a smuggler who's trying to find his lost wife, and also a satellite kingdom that's kind of getting involved with rebellion. Again, conceptually, I loved everything that was going on here. But the first one, and especially the second one, just everything felt so convenient and how the plot sort of began to play out. I was not very sold on our characters. They kind of didn't feel fully dynamic or developed. It's so disappointing that I'm saying this, but the first one has like a 4.04, the second one has like a 4.5. I just feel like I'm missing something. I don't understand why I don't love this, and I wanted to love it so much, but the more I sit with it, like the more I don't like it. You know what I mean? Sometimes that happens. But yes, this is my last overhyped book series. Alrighty guys, those are some popular books that I personally think are overhyped. Please let me know down below some popular books that you think are overhyped, as I would love to know. And I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye.